For the last couple of decades, the discourse on mass surveillance has been mostly dominated by apprehension towards government institutions, with concerns directed at how that information could be used against citizens, and much less attention given towards the activities of tech industry giants. All of this adds up to a cooperative relationship between Google and federal, state, and local governments. The government scratches Google's back, and Google scratches theirs by giving them access to all of that sweet, sweet data. Surveillance Incorporated Part 1 explored some aspects of the relationship between corporate tech firms and government spy agencies, such as the National Security Agency's PRISM program, a collaborative effort between the NSA and tech industry giants such as at&t, Verizon, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, Apple, and Facebook. From there, we examined other aspects of collaboration between corporations and governments, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google's adherence to European Union hate speech policies. Indeed, Facebook has promised to double its safety and security staff by the end of 2018, and Google has announced that they're adding 10,000 new reviewers to clean up YouTube. Along with these announcements comes an alleged leak of YouTube's demonetization policies. According to the leak, a third-party private agency is handling the demonetization review process. Reviewers are given a list of criteria to determine if a video should be demonetized or not. Quote, "One of the most important things to take away from this is that if the person reviewing the video wouldn't feel comfortable watching the video in public, it should automatically be demonetized. My contact stated that the company told them that if they were on the fence about a video and didn't really know if it violated any of YouTube's new rules, to demonetize the video anyway. Also, if the reviewer doesn't find anything listed that's wrong with the video, they are allowed to insert their own personal belief on something that is sensitive or inappropriate and can have the video demonetized that way as well." Unquote. But more disturbingly, the leak mentions a long-term plan to kick unwanted creators off of YouTube. Quote, "A different contact of mine was involved in the secret meeting with YouTube, which took place around mid-2016 at a Google office in Los Angeles. The meeting had one purpose, to discuss what should be done with unwanted creators on their platform. Some unwanted channel names that were mentioned were Leafy is Here, Grade A Under A, Keemstar, Scarce, and Onision. In attendance were a number of higher-ranking individuals from a few different departments at YouTube. CEO Susan Wojcicki was not in attendance. All the creators in attendance were made to sign NDAs. The creators were asked what they felt should be done about the more toxic channels on YouTube. There was no conclusion from YouTube's end, but it was agreed upon that no censorship or channel deletion should occur and that something else should be done. Months later, the demonetization began sweeping the platform and hindering the growth of countless channels." Unquote. So if relatively innocuous channels like Grade A Under A and Leafy is Here are under the gun, it's safe to assume that anyone discussing political issues, world events, or anything even remotely controversial is at risk as well. In fact, several relatively small channels have been deplatformed in the last few weeks. YouTubers Colin Flaherty, The Quartering, and Demography is Destiny all had their channels flat out deleted. YouTube has a monopolistic hold over online video streaming, with very few competitors, none of which are able to match its size and scope. It's clear that we have accepted a massive level of control over our personal data and intrusions into our privacy, as well as our ability to speak, with corporations and government working in concert to maximize the effect. And when it's not the government mandating censorious policies, big companies like Google are happy to engage in deplatforming of their own volition. But how exactly did this happen? How did big tech get so big? The controversial debate over what we call net neutrality embodies the latest in a series of regulatory efforts that actually favor tech giants like Google. Net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers must treat all data on the internet the same, and not discriminate or charge differently by user, content, website, platform, or method of communication. For instance, under these principles, internet service providers are unable to intentionally block, slow down, or charge money for specific websites or online content. This might sound really nice in theory. After all, none of us want our access to material and online services to be unduly restricted. But what are the implications when these standards are applied to tech industry giants who are themselves users of the internet? Imagine if, instead of paying for fuel on a per unit basis, you paid for it through a subscription. Let's say you're paying $50 per month to use the local gas station as much as you want. Now imagine that your town has a regulation stating that no one can be charged differently for fuel. Everyone pays the same subscription fee. And now let's imagine a large shipping company company has set up ground operations near your town. If you pull up with your car and buy 20 gallons worth of fuel, the regulation states that you'll pay the same rate as a semi-truck driver buying 200 gallons of fuel. All factors considered, the shipping company would incur a disproportionate impact on the local infrastructure, and the cost of covering that impact would be distributed across everyone who uses that fueling station, not just to the large company creating the increased demand, since, as per the rules, everyone has to be treated exactly the same. This is essentially what's happening when a company like Google consumes disproportionate amounts of bandwidth. They are necessitating an expansion of network infrastructure and ultimately passing the cost on to everyone who uses the internet. A 2008 analysis of Cisco Systems networking data estimated that Google alone used 16.5% of all US consumer internet traffic in 2008, and that share was estimated to grow to 25% in 2009 and 37% in 2010. Meanwhile, Google's payments for consumer bandwidth usage were estimated to be approximately $344 million in 2008, or just 0.8% of all US flat-rate monthly internet access costs. In other words, Google's 16.5% share of 2008 bandwidth usage was 21 times greater than Google's 0.8% share of consumer bandwidth costs. This amounted to an estimated $6.9 billion in a sort of implicit subsidy, bandwidth costs passed on to the market as a whole rather than laid at the feet of tech giants like Google. Imagine how much bigger these numbers have grown since then, as Google has expanded. Other big tech companies such as Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft also consume disproportionate amounts of data. Bandwidth is not an endless resource. It requires physical infrastructure and electricity in order to flow, and so disproportionate consumption on such a massive scale means that the expense incurred by big tech is being passed on to all of us. Under net neutrality rules, the big data companies were actually required to give this freebie to big tech. Of course, back in 2008, the FCC's net neutrality rules had not yet been enacted. Prior to the precursor study, a Verizon executive had called for an end to Google's free lunch. Big data was already giving a pass to big tech even before net neutrality was enacted, so I'm skeptical of the notion that net neutrality's removal will result in big data taking the gloves off. We're often confronted by warnings that the removal of the 2015 net neutrality ruling will result in abusive policies by broadband providers, that our access to less traveled websites, streaming video, and online games could be hindered by preferential and unfair throttling of connection speeds. But this obviously wasn't the case prior to 2015, at least not generally speaking. It's obvious that consumer protection should be taken into account, but we must mind the fact that big tech corporations are consumers too, and their patterns of bandwidth usage should not be treated the same as the average person with a PC or smartphone. In light of this information, it should be fairly obvious why Twitter, Apple, Facebook, and Google all voiced their support of the 2015 net neutrality rules loudly and proudly. When their bandwidth usage is treated the same as your bandwidth usage, it very clearly benefits them. The rules, as they were written, amounted to a form of regulatory capture, government policy which benefited the entities it was supposed to keep in check. The broadband providers should start charging big tech companies differently from the rest of us now that net neutrality rules are no longer preventing them from doing so, but whether or not they actually will is an open question. Unfortunately, mismanagement of bandwidth usage costs is just one aspect of the greater problem presented by the artificial monopolies in the tech and data sectors. Google is actually building its own broadband provider service called Google Fiber, and state and municipal governments are tripping over themselves to subsidize the establishment of Google's infrastructure. Quoting from Ars Technica, Google received stunning regulatory concessions and incentives from local governments, including free access to virtually everything Kansas City owns or controls, rights of way, central office space, power, interconnections with anchor institutions, marketing and direct mail, and office space for Google employees. City officials also expedited the permitting process and assigned staff specifically to help Google. One county even offered to allow Google to hang its wires on parts of utility poles for free that are usually off limits to communication companies. Indeed, the agreement between Google and Kansas City, Missouri specified that the city would make space available to Google in city facilities for the installation of Google's central office equipment and for additional network facilities, will provide power necessary for Google's equipment at city locations, and will not charge Google for such space, power, or related services. And unfortunately, FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai doesn't seem to have a problem with this, stating in 2012 that it is critically important that states and local communities adopt broadband-friendly policies agencies when it comes to rights of way management. And the agreement between Kansas City and Google actually included a confidentiality clause, so no one really knows exactly how much this costs taxpayers. All of this to set up broadband services that only Google can financially profit from. So even with the death of net neutrality, there's no guarantee that big tech and big data will put themselves on better behavior in the interest of the consumer. In addition to big data's history of giving big tech a pass on their consumption and the government actively subsidizing this activity, recent revelations regarding microprocessors throws the competence and benevolence of the tech industry into question even further. In Part 1 of Surveillance Incorporated, we also examined the potential vulnerabilities in Intel's management engine and the associated Minix subsystem. Intel recently admitted that this Ring-3 subsystem contains vulnerabilities, allowing it to function as an all-access backdoor, including the loading and execution of arbitrary code outside the visibility of the user and operating system, system crashes and instability, and even outright impersonation of the management engine itself. And now, much broader vulnerabilities have been revealed in the form of a software exploit called Meltdown, a security flaw affecting virtually all microprocessors made by Intel, along with a sister exploit known as Spectre, affecting AMD and ARM architecture microprocessors as well as Intel's. These security flaws affect desktops, laptops, tablets, phones, and cloud servers. By exploiting Meltdown and Spectre, an attacker can gain full access to any information stored in arbitrary system memory, including passwords or anything else being held in memory by a user-level application. The implications are massive, as millions of devices containing sensitive information are affected by these bugs. And to make matters worse, the problem is baked into CPUs at a hardware level, meaning that there are only two ways to fix it. Either redesign the chip architecture in a massive manufacturing effort and product recall, or change the way user-level operating systems interact with the hardware. Although Meltdown and Spectre don't appear to be related to the Intel management engine's own vulnerabilities, Intel has now revised their public statements on the management engine's weaknesses in the wake of Meltdown and Spectre's exposure. The November 2017 press release on the management engine's flaws has been updated to include much older generations of processors, including ones that were originally stated to preclude the hardware implementation of the management engine. Maybe Intel was spooked into being more honest about the security threat posed by the management engine after the public became aware of Meltdown. Make no mistake, Meltdown and Spectre pose an extremely broad threat. If you've bought any kind of computer or mobile device in the last decade, you're almost certainly at risk, and massive cloud storage facilities used by the tech industry and other private businesses are at risk as well. Until the new microprocessor exploits are fixed, no one's data is safe. And how does Intel repay us for this? Well, it turns out that Intel executives were aware of the hardware vulnerabilities as far back as June of 2017 and didn't publicly acknowledge them until much later, but not before Intel CEO Brian Krzanich sold off $24 million of his personally held stock in the company. All told, trusting megacorporations with all of our sensitive data truly seems to have led to the death of privacy as we know it, whether by error or by collusion with government institutions. Google is bigger than ever and aims to get bigger, and their infrastructure is built on Intel's compromised microprocessors. So not only is our data being collected en masse and transferred to government spy agencies, and in some cases used to politically censor us, but the process of collecting and storing all that data isn't even internally secure. The cyberpunk future is well underway, but instead of neon lights and hoverboards, it's all run down and seemingly held together with duct tape, while the people in charge of this apparatus lie straight to your face. Your smartphone and your computer aren't just sources of entertainment, they're windows into your habits and your thoughts, and everyone in charge of managing or regulating the services you use has a vested interest in downplaying the extent of their intrusions into your life. Big tech and big data are getting a free ride at a massive cost to your privacy and speech. The unmasking of the management engine and Meltdown and the death of mandated net neutrality are, in my opinion, important steps in the right direction. There isn't a simple solution to any of this, but if you value privacy or your right to speak uncensored, it's time to start talking about it.